Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second Friends of the Boston Harborwalk virtual tour / webinar. I'm joined this evening by Steve Landrikins, who is going to be telling you all about the incredible history of East Boston. Steve is a member of the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk. It's an all-volunteer organization that does a bunch of stuff that he's going to tell you about at the beginning of his presentation. The volunteers are closely affiliated with the Boston Harbor Now, which is the nonprofit where I'm the Director of Planning. And I'm excited to be hosting Steve tonight. We're thrilled that all of you can join us and learn about this. We look forward to hearing from you and doing lots of great Q&A at the end, but I'm not gonna keep talking. I'm gonna turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Alice. That's very, very grateful for your helping me work my way through that. This is my first time I've done something like this, and as a man of the 20th century, it's all very daunting. Okay, so Friends of the Boston Harborwalk. This is a group of folks who got together on our own time, and we tried to find ways to get people to use the Harborwalk. The Harborwalk is a 42-mile stretch along the waterfront of the Boston Harbor, mostly contiguous. There are a few bits that are missing. I'll show you in a few minutes. And we encourage people to come out just to enjoy it for what it is, but also to find out some of the history. I mean, the Boston Harbor is very, very, very loaded with history, and a lot of it along the shore. So what we want to do is take you to one small wedge of East Boston and talk about that, as partly because when we do our tours, we break it up. Sometimes there'll be something at South Boston, sometimes in Charlestown, sometimes in the North End. And in East Boston, we have 3 or 4 different segments that we do tours on. So it seems like an odd choice of some of the places we're going to tonight. It's just because they're contiguous. We're supposed to be out walking, but I'm glad we're not, because it's pouring down rain where I am here in West Roxbury. So what I'm going to do is bring up, if I remember how to do it, my stack of slides. There we are. Okay. Just to get you introduced into where we're going tonight. East Boston is an area right across Boston, right across the harbor of Boston from downtown Boston, which is on a peninsula called the Shormet Peninsula. If we had been, wait a minute, trying to make it go to the next one. If we had been together tonight, we would have met at the Maverick Peace Station, which this is not it. Oh, well, no, wait a minute. I rearranged some screens about 10 minutes ago. Put these pictures up. This is how East Boston looked when I was a kid. It was wrecky. The shoreline was awful. It was chain link fenced away from the rest of us. This guy out there with his dog, but mostly it was very, very hard to get onto anything close to the water. That's all changed now, or changing. And what we're seeing is buildings like this coming up, very, very high-end apartment buildings, condos that are taking over where these wrecky docks used to be. It's changing the face of East Boston, but more or less around the edges, along the waterfront, whereas the central part of East Boston remains the very fascinating and diverse neighborhood that it has always been. The airline view here of East Boston, the yellow arrow points to Maverick Square, where we would have started our walk tonight at the Maverick T station, but it gives you some sense of East Boston. And I've got my cursor. This is wonderful that works. I'll show you a map in a minute, but we basically are doing this little stretch here. It's about less than a mile, and it would have taken us 2 hours to go pass through everything that's there, take a look at stuff, and hear about some of the stories. We're not going to have as much time tonight, so we're going to have to conflate some things, but just give some idea. Whoops, something wrong there. Oh, look at that. This is, I've mapped out the portions of our walk here. First, we would have walked from Maverick Square down to the end of Lewis Street. So much happened on that little stretch of land. Very few evidences of it today, but one of the nice things about doing this by a webinar and Zoom is that I can put in lots of pictures for you to help you see it. Then normally we would go along the front of the water right here where the Harborwalk is being built, but on that little segment it's still under construction. So we would have backtracked here, come over to a place known as Carlton's Wharf. A lot of history happened there too. Then from Carlton's Wharf we would have gone over to what's called now Low Presti Park. It used to be a series of old wharves. And then up here to just by Decatur Street. where we're going to see the old Marine Railway. That'll all make more sense after you see some pictures. Oh, look at this. I knew I was going to do that. Anyway, this is one of the earliest views of East Boston. This is sketched from the top of the Boston State House. And where that blue arrow is, it points to where we would have been if we had walked from Maverick Station down to the waterfront. The main thing to know in 1801 is to notice how absolutely empty it is. The reason for that, you can see it on this map from 1806, is that look all around here, mud flats. I mean, there's a lot of mud flats in Boston Harbor, but they're very, very much so here. Indeed, the Logan Airport is built on mud flats. Logan Airport would be in this area around here, and it's very, very shallow water. Very, very hard to get a boat over there unless you were, having like a raft or a scow or something like that. There's only, and almost nobody lived there. And yet, meanwhile, across the harbor in Boston, this 1825 view shows you just how crowded the waterfront is. Wharves were small, ships were getting bigger. More importantly, there was no place there to build a ship, and that was in a city like Boston, whose economic engine was sea trade. That was a real concern. But look across the harbor at Nautilus Island, as it was called then, empty. Boston is full, Charlestown is full, Nautilus is empty. So it's just there waiting for something to happen. And this is the man who made it happen. His name was General William Hyslop Sumner, general because he fought in the War of 1812. He's very, very much a part of the Boston establishment. He born in Roxbury, went to Phillips Andover, went to Harvard, became a lawyer. His father had been a governor of Massachusetts. He got the rank of general by fighting with the Massachusetts militia in Portland, Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts during the War of 1812. That's all background. But the important thing about him is that his mother's family inherited Nautilus Island. He himself owned about half of it. His cousins owned the rest. And from 1801, he tried to start developing it. He wanted to bring a road down that would come down from Salem to the north of Boston. Having brought that road and having set up a ferry across to Boston, he thought he could then get people to settle there. Didn't work. He had to wait another 32 years. And he finally put together something called the East Boston Company with a couple of investors, probably people he knew. I have their names, but I don't know anything about them. It's hard to find out some of these things. And he got some other people to invest in things in what he was going to call East Boston. And things like a wharf. You had to have a wharf. You can't have an island developed without a wharf. And it was expensive because it had to be out to deep water because of those mud flats. So he was the one who came up with the name of calling this East Boston. Up to then, as you can see, it was just Nautilus Island. But he was a great organizer, and he made things happen very, very quickly. For instance, within a year, he had a young civil engineer named Robert Henry Eddy devise this plan for East Boston. It's not exactly what is there now, but it's very, very close. Partly because he was working or the land that existed with some plans of filling things in, but not all the land that's there now. And you'll notice too, there's a strange looking canal across the center of East Boston. That was there to create tidal power, to make mills. As tides came in and came out, water rushing through would turn turbines. It never was built. It was an idea that was dropped. And then look, a map 10 years later, look all of these streets now. It's not just a few of them. And even where there's no land, you see above that word basin, which is all filled in now. That was just sea marsh and mud flats, but they just had plans. I think Sumner was of the opinion that if he built it, they would come. And it turns out he was right. In my research for this, I made a lovely list of numbers of how many were there in 1834 and how many which was 8 before they started development. And by 1840, it was like 8,000, and by 1860, it was about 30,000. I'm just made those numbers up, but it was kind of like that. But I've lost them. When you do this research, you get so many pieces of paper. Anyway, there we are. But one way of judging the success of his work is that, look at this little picture of the Boston Sugar Refinery. It was built on the waterfront in it was the first industry that was set up in East Boston, and it was built in, that building dates from 1836. What's interesting about it is that it's right there on the water. One good thing to remember about this thing, this is a place where granulated sugar was invented in 1853. Before that, sugar came in a lump, and you had to have special tools to break a chunk off, and then you had to grind it up and use it the way you wanted. But these folks came up with a process of breaking the moist refined sugar over steam tables and drying them into separate crystals. And then they could pack the loose sugar into bags, and they could sell it by weight. So it was a major advancement. But just think of what that 8-story building would have looked like from across the harbor in Boston. If we have any historic architecture people listening, I'd love you to chime in. If you know of any 8-story buildings on the other side of the harbor, maybe a couple of the wharfs were, but it must have been a very, very impressive site. And it's probably, Sumner would have loved it because it meant that people looking across could see that East Boston, this is within 2 years of its having come into being, was a place to be taken seriously for doing business. And look now, that was in, what year was that? That was, I don't know. That was 1836, 1837, 38. Now we get up here to this map, which comes from 1889. It's a bird's eye view, and where that yellow arrow points is where the Boston Sugar Refinery now is. Well inland, because the land has been filled in front of it. And here we go, we got these funny maps. You can see here, the map on the left is how it used to look, how it originally looked, and the first plan by R.H. Eddy. And the blue lines show all of that got filled in. The red line, the green line shows where the sugar refinery is. All that water in front of it stopped being water real soon. And then the red line shows where I think something called Smith's Hill was. Smith's Hill was a hill owned by a Mr. Smith. And it was leveled probably by, pick and shovel and horse carts and whatnot to fill in the land in the waterfront there to bring the mud flats up to some kind of level where they could be walked on and used. It was a whole lot easier than trying to dredge them out. And then on the map on the right-hand side, where you see a green arrow, that shows how far inland now the Boston Sugar Refinery is. So it gives you some sense of how things go. Now, down here at the tip of that map, where my cursor is now, that became a major ferry terminal. It became known as the South Ferry, an extension of Lewis Street, if you see that name there. We'll talk about that more later. But that made it very, very central to all of East Boston, because everything depended on what came and went on the ferries. Now, if you were to look at the site of the Boston Sugar Refineries now, this is what you would see, this low-slung brick building. It's a series of houses called the South Bremen Street building, very different from before. But it just points to how much change is constant in East Boston. Now, if you stand with your back to where I was just had that camera pointing towards the side of the houses, you're looking down what used to be Lewis Street. It is Lewis Street farther down, but part of it is a green a mall that was built. Underneath that mall is the MBTA's Blue Line. And what, in fact, where the grass is where the original wharf was. It was a wharf that was owned by 4 people. One of the investors was named Lewis. Guess who the street is named after? The other one was Ami Lombard. Lombard, later this wharf, which was called East Boston Wharf, became known as Lombard Wharf. And one of the other investors was Robert Gould Shaw, the father of the young soldier who was killed in South Carolina during the Civil War. And had we been there tonight, we would have walked right down this street to the water. Where we're standing now is pretty much would have been the water's edge, even maybe behind us in 1833. But now it's about 3 football fields down to the water's edge. And we would be walking on Lewis Street right down this map, where this map shows of the dock. One of the names of the dock, it was after Lombard, it became known as the National Dock and Warehouse Company because that was who was on it. Um, in the 1950s, we knew it as the ferry dock. Now it's called Clipper Ship Wharf. It's a development, which we can talk about in a minute. But clipper ships weren't actually built here. Again, we come back to the mud. It was too muddy. And they were built around another side of East Boston, facing out on Chelsea Creek, where there were beaches, more gravelly beaches, that gave them a place to work. Now, this is a man you need to know about, and you probably never heard about him. His name is Otis Tufts. He was one of the most remarkable people, and he was emblematic of the great ingenuity that seemed to spring forth from East Boston. Otis Tufts had a shop on this dock. It was before, would have been along here from what I can guess. But this is an insurance map, and it was drawn after Otis Tufts had died. Otis Tufts is famous for two things. One is he was the first man to build a iron boat in the United States. You see a schematic of it there on the left. It was double hulled, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. He's also famous because he's the first one who actually built a passenger elevator. Not to be confused with Elisha Otis, and I'll talk about him in a later too. Elisha Otis also was an elevator inventor, but he didn't do passenger elevators, he did freight elevators. So Otis Tufts gets the nod for being the developer of the passenger elevator, but he didn't follow through in the way that Elisha Otis's family did. Now, Otis Tufts was born in Cambridge. He's a distant relative of the man who endowed Tufts University, like a fifth cousin. He went to Lowell he worked as a shoemaker in Boston. Obviously, he's bored out of his mind, which is very fertile and always looking for new things. Went to Lowell, where with the cloth factories and whatnot, he was able to get a job as a mechanic. Did various things up there. Came back to Boston after about 10 years. And where by then he had begun to see how steam-powered engines were working in the mills in Lowell. And he started applying that to all kinds of things. First one was for a printing press. There had been steam-operated printing presses in London since 1814, but nothing in the United States. So he did that, and he actually made quite a little money out of it, and he made a name for himself as well. He also did things like steam-powered marble cutting machines, steam-powered sugar pressing, cane pressing machines to be getting sugar, and firefighting equipment, all kinds of stuff. But what he was probably the greatest contribution he gave to us, for which he's got very little credit, is in the building of the old customs house in downtown Boston. This is its original iteration before it had a tower on it. He was walking by there one morning, and he saw the guys putting in piles into the muck of the Boston coastal area, and they needed about 6,000 of them to be able to lay the foundation, and they were doing it by hand. And he said, "Come on, guys, if you do it by hand, it's going to take you to the year 2000 to get it all done." And the foreman recognized him as the inventor of the steam-powered printing press, and he made a kind of a snarky comment that saying, seeing you can build a printing press, do you think it can build a customs house as well? And Tufts said, yeah, come back the next day and tell him if he could. Well, the next day he came back with a design for a steam-powered pile driver, which is something that had never been done before. He got some guys to build it. They put it to work, and the rest was history. Unfortunately, he never patented it, so he never got any money out of it. He just did it for the joy of making something work. If he patented it, he would have been a wealthy man. And one of his problems in life was that he wasn't a particularly good businessman, and sometimes he didn't patent things till after they were out there, and he lost becoming the fabulous wealthy man that he should have been. Well, this is the ship. We talked a minute ago about the ironbound ship. These are a couple of pictures we have of it. It was called the R.B. Forbes because Robert Bennett Forbes was a China trader in Boston and made himself a lot of fortune. I should say Milton. He actually lived in Milton. And he had money to throw around. So he convinced the Boston Marine Underwriters, which was an insurance group, of which I think he was probably a principal, to have an ironclad, not ironclad, it's an iron ship built because the Marine Underwriters wanted to salvage wreckage of wooden ships that had gone down or been wrecked or whatever. And they needed a really powerful boat with powerful engines. And so they enlisted Otis Tufts. And he in turn went to a guy named John Ericsson, a Swedish American who was working in New York, who, like himself, was kind of an autodidact who came up with all kinds of interesting ideas. Later in life, Ericsson designed the ship, the Monitor, USS Monitor, which fought in the Civil War so successfully. So he got from Ericsson, Tufts got ideas for a double propeller. The propellers turned in opposite directions, became very, very strong as a result. It was all very new, steam powered, of course. And then he built the ship, which in the end was not used for salvaging wreckage so much as it was for towing wooden clipper ships and even smaller ones built in Boston to New York. A lot of New York merchants commissioned the shipbuilding to Boston ship makers. But then once the ship was finished, it wasn't ready to sail, it had to be taken to New York, outfitted with sails, various other things. And so this little boat would take it to them. The thing about Otis and his lack of business acumen is that he wanted to tell people about what he had done with his double-hulled iron boat, and so he promoted it in England, among other places, and all around the United States. And this guy, his name is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. If you've ever been to England, you've benefited from his engineering genius. Tunnels, train trestles, highways, all kinds of things. In the Victorian era, he was he was like the Otis Tufts of England, but you might not see it that way. But he stole Tufts' idea on how to create that double hull, and he used it to build the ship in the picture on the right. And this was in its time, I think the longest ship was something like 4,000. I forget how many feet long, but it could take 4,000 passengers, and the idea is it could go to Australia without refueling. But Otis Tufts wasn't happy about this. He sent his son-in-law to England, served notice on the ship, and said, you owe me some money for my idea. Brunel pulled a fast one. He said, well, if you're going to take me to court, I will require you to post a £10,000 bond that if you lose your case, then my expenses are covered. Tufts didn't have the £10,000, so it died there. But it taught him a lesson, and he went home and patented the boat. But by then it was a little late. And this cute little picture is a painting. It's of the boat. It's the best illustration we have of it. And there's a long story. The ship in front of it is the Uss Jamestown, which Robert Bennett Forbes had outfitted to take food to Ireland during the famine. And so the painting is mostly about the Jamestown and the RB Robert Bennett Forbes, the RB Forbes, the tugboat is just in the background, but I've highlighted that here. Forbes obviously wanted to have his favorite little boat in it. There was somebody was writing in the 1909 saying that the RB Forbes little tugboat was a well-known character around the United States. She generally was on hand for launches, regattas, celebrations, and champagne corks flying about her deck and so on. So anyway, so that's Otis Tufts and his boats. But this is his elevator. I don't know what any of these schematics mean, but they're key elements in his elevator. It's the one on the left. Appears to be like a large screw, and that is how his elevator worked. It was, rather than going up and down on ropes, he had a chamber that was on a screw. It turned slowly, and I guess this would be the elevator here where the cursor is now, and by the screw turning slowly, rollers would roll it up, and there was a braking mechanism to make sure it didn't just come running like down and go. There was a steam powered, this is a boiler, and this was something to do with something else. So sorry, I can't tell you, but we could not find out much about it. This is from a Scientific American. But he got this into two of the biggest hotels, newest hotels in the United States that were built at the time in 1859. Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York, the Continental in Philadelphia, and this thing in New York was an event. People like the Prince of Wales and President Grant and this one that. Anybody who was anybody had to come and ride the elevator. And as you can see, it only went up about 6-7 stories. And it was quite slow, but it was very comfortable. It's like a room you would go in and sit down in. But it was impractical. You couldn't do it for tall buildings. And safe as it was, it just, it was probably not as fast as the stairs. Tufts also did some other things with elevator ropes and things, but that's another story. And the man who really made his name in elevators is this guy, Elisha Otis. And he took this one of his elevators to the World's Fair in 1854 in New York and demonstrated it. You see him up on the platform there. He had just cut the rope that was pulling the thing up, and it didn't crash down, proving that what he invented that was so important was a brake for the elevator, which hadn't happened before. So when a rope broke, it just came down. So anyway, he died young, but his sons took on the business, and the rest is the Otis Elevator Company. And Otis Tufts, when died, his sons were not interested in the elevator things. They carried on some of his other projects. So now, the East Boston Ferry. For generations, 4 generations of my family lived in East Boston, both sides of the family. They had fled the Great Hunger in Ireland and came here, found refuge in East Boston. They worked their way up the economic ladder. And East Boston is really where we became Americans. It's a story that continues today for many, many other people who are newly arriving. But for me, we would go to East Boston from time to time to see relatives, to walk around the neighborhood my father grew up in. But to me, the best part of it was going on the ferry boat. The ferry boats were there until 1952. And it was a magical thing. It was about, I don't know, they say it was 20 minutes to cross. I think maybe it was 20 minutes to load, cross, and unload. It just seemed like it was over way too soon. But East Boston exists because of the ferry boats. And this is the end of Lewis Wharf. Remember that green mall? I said there was the blue line underneath it. Well, the blue line's underneath this too. But this is where you drove right down here and you drove onto the boat. And if you look through the gatehouse there, you can see a couple of cars that are on a boat there. You don't see the boat so well, but there they are waiting to go across. You could walk on too, and so people would go through turnstiles, much like they might do in a subway. Walk-on passengers would sit on these benches in what was called the Companionway, which was alongside the compartment for the cars on either side. And at the top here, this gentleman here is my granduncle, John Callahan. He was a gatekeeper on the ferries, and I thought he owned the ferries when I was little. But he would wave us on, like when my father was driving up, he'd wave the car on and then tell everybody what to do and close the gate and walk to the other end of the boat and then yell to the pilot a couple of times and then wave us all off. And it was a disappointment when I discovered that he just worked there. But if you notice the date, March 30th, 1918, this is to allow him to go onto the waterfront I wonder if I've been blocking you. Because that was the time of the First World War, and unless you were a registered something American, you couldn't go anywhere near. You couldn't go on Marginal Street or on Border Street. In the neighborhood where my father grew up, there was a husband and wife bakers from Alsace-Lorraine. The husband was on the German side of the equation, the wife French. The husband was not allowed to go down onto Border or Marginal, but his wife could. That's the ways of things. Interestingly enough, at the bottom of Lewis Street now, where you a moment ago saw the South Ferry shed, it's now is where the water taxi has a dock to take you across to Boston. I think that these two piers here probably were part of the ferry. And if somebody knows that, I'd love to hear from you. Been asking around for several weeks, and I can't quite get a clear answer on that. Ferries were going back and forth. They would take off from one side and then to the other in no time at all. They'd be over there. I've lost my place here, my paper, sorry. And then this is the Northbury. I've just showed you the South Ferry. A competing company set up a Northbury a short distance up. It's about where, if you know where Lopresti Park is today. The picture, the larger picture on the right is the terminus in East Boston. The one on the left is in the North End, going across. The North Ferry started because it was a price war, a competition. People were unhappy with the South Ferry. They thought they were charging too much. Somebody said, I can do it better and cheaper. He tried. It didn't really work, but he forced the South Ferry to lower its prices a little bit. Finally, the city took over both ferries and charged only 1 penny for either one of them. Took over the ferries in 1870. I'm just looking at my notes here. And in 1887 established the 1 cent fare for foot passengers. So that's how they became known as the penny ferry. And here you see, just for the joy of it, the ferries, each one coming into their respective berths on opposite sides of the harbor. This is a sentimental picture. This is the last crossing of the ferry from South Ferry. I should have mentioned that the North Ferry closed, don't know, sometime about, sorry, I don't have a date, but it closed in the 30s, I think, sometime like that. This is the South Ferry coming over, and I was on that, and I was a 4-year-old kid, and because of Uncle Jack, we were going to go up into the pilot house. My 2 older brothers did, and I was terrified. It was a straight ladder going up, and when you looked down, you looked into the hold of the ship, and they had the boilers going in the fire, and I was, no, I wouldn't do that. Anyway, so that was the end of the ferries, and one of the reasons that the ferries faded was because a subway line had been dug under the harbor. This is really quite a remarkable thing. This is in 1900 or 1899, really, when it kind of got started. It was originally, as you can see from the upper map, was meant to go to Ballard's Wharf and then go up through the north end up Hanover Street. Instead, it came over here to Long Wharf and went up State Street, which is here where my cursor is. The cutaway shows you where it's built below grade, and it's just, those are the kind of maps you can spend the rest of the day looking at. Pictures of construction. Workmen, a lot of Italians had begun moving to East Boston in the 1880s. A lot of the crews working on the tunnel construction were Italian. It's something like it took 3 years, 2.5 years to dig the tunnel. It cost $3 million, a lot of money in those days, and cost the lives of 4 of the workmen. On the East Boston side, there were so many postcards made of this portal. It seemed to be a very exciting thing. There are gates that could close, but you almost think people could just walk into the tunnel anytime they wanted. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, you're seeing what it looked like at Atlantic Avenue, which was the first stop when you came across the harbor. And this is for you subway mavens, the Court Street station. It's no longer there. It was underneath the courthouse. A picture on the right, you can just barely see the kiosk at the bottom of the lower column. And then it was changed in 1924, what we now know as the Blue Line. Now, this is the real story of this. They converted it from streetcars to this metro rail, or at least the part under the harbor. What happened was the train would come under the harbor, stop at Maverick, and go back. But then from Maverick north, it would still be streetcars. But in the weekend of April 18th to 21st in 1924, the East Boston Tunnel was converted from a streetcar use to high platform rapid transit, as they officially call it. And a changeover that had been planned for 3 years. It required 1,500 men to complete. But in one weekend, they changed a whole system in the subway. Does anybody ride the Red Line? Do you know how impossible it is to even consider something like this happening in a weekend? Anyway, one last note on that. We're just talking about why the Blue Line does not connect to the Red Line, because the Red Line is the train that takes everybody to Kendall Square and Harvard and where all the smart people are. In fact, it could easily be done. What you see here is a portal for the Blue Line that comes out on Cambridge Street at the bottom of Beacon Hill. The tunnels are still there. It could be opened up. It could go right down to Charles Street and connect there. Now, when you were going down Lewis Avenue and Lewis Street, I was a kid, you would see these grumpy old buildings and tired and foreboding and so on. That all came down in the 1950s. The waterfront was a mess. This is how we saw it. Now this is what's coming up in its place. This is something called Clipper Ship Wharf. It's a very, very interesting development. Not just because it's nice looking houses where there used to be trashy old piers, because the developers, Halverson, are trying to find out ways of connecting to the water, not just looking at it. So they've created what they call intertidal zones. They've used there's so many granite blocks there from old seawalls and piers and things. They've used them to create terraces and have tried and put in different types of grasses and plants and trees and things up there to try to help people who are living there to feel connected to the water, and also to test out certain things as the salinity of the sea changes with global warming and on. It just becomes what one of the developers there, Rob Adams, told me, is like a living petri dish, where they can see what's coming and what's going. They also put in a couple of bridges. This is at low tide, so it doesn't look much like a bridge, but so the idea is that you're not just looking at the water, but you're kind of interacting in it by crossing over it. And they were created off the end of the pier this fascinating intertidal zone, which we and the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk have created one of our interpretive signs, which tells you about the different grasses that were planted there and how they are a way of understanding the tidal cycle and so on and so forth. But the funny story here is that the grasses were planted and they tasted very good to the geese, and so there's not much grass here now. But some has come back, and that's done it on its own. So rather than planting grass, the idea is just to let those grasses stay there, and let's just see if they spread and if other things come that are more naturally suited for it. Now, I mentioned there's parts of the Harborwalk that are not yet built. This is one of them around Clipper Ship Wharf. And the picture on the upper hand on the left. Look at the large one on the right. That's where it's under construction. They tell me it'll be completed by next April. We'll be happy for that. The one on the left, left, is to show you how these buildings are being constructed. Notice there's a great big passageway underneath the first floor of residences, and then there's an area out here which the developers refer to as a glass box. It could hold some kind of a merchandising place or a small restaurant or something. But the notion is, it's understood that the sea is rising, that there will be tides that have to be thought of differently from what we have nowadays, and this gives the water a place to go, so it doesn't just smash into the buildings. It can go around them or through them and ameliorate the effects of the wave action. Okay, on to the next wharf now. Carlton's Wharf. Picture that gives you an idea. This is what the Boston waterfront was looking like. There were lots and lots and lots of pictures like these and lots of wharves back in the 1880s. And by 1900, that was all gone. Something called the Hodge Boiler Works was built on that site. It's gone now itself. That lasted about 100 years to about 2006. And these buildings show the Hodge just before it was torn down. But it was an amazing place that built boilers and for ships, for the mills in Lowell, elsewhere as well, water tanks, anything involving metal. they were doing it, and but the reason it's on the waterfront is because it was there because the reliance on wind and sail was fading. The age of the clipper ships was pretty much over by about 1960, although at 1860 they continued to linger for a while. But even if Otis Tufts was building his iron ship in 1854, and it was the way of the future. Things were going that to steam power. But Hodge did other things as well, and the most interesting one to me, story uncovered by my colleague and friend Dan Bailey. One of them is this hyperbaric operating room that they built in East Boston, working with a company called Vacudyne. And the idea was to be able to operate on babies in a place with a very, very high air pressure, because regular oxygen systems wouldn't work on anybody smaller than 45 pounds. So by having a hyperbaric chamber, they could continue to have the blood circulation go on unimpeded. Oxygen molecules would get into all the infant's tissues, and it would allow them to stop the heart and the blood circulation for a few minutes to correct any kind of defect that was there. Really a remarkable thing, and built there at Hodge Boiler Works in East Boston. So it had two chambers. One of the first was this round chamber where the operating rooms, they had up to 16 doctors in there. And then they had a second decompression chamber where, to come out like a diver rising up from the depths in a pressurized suit. It takes a while to come up before you can be safe. It only was only used for about 10 years. Advances in other ways of oxygenating infants came along and made this not necessary. But it was a lifesaver. About 120 infants were benefited from it. So I love this picture. It shows the circular chamber arriving at the Children's Hospital. Now, where Hodge Boilers once sat, you now have a new condo building go up. It's called the Mark in East Boston. Condos for sale. This is the new East Boston. Right next to it is the thing I love. This is Lopresti Park. Lopresti Park is an area. It's part of the planning for the new East Boston, is to make sure there's places for people to get out and enjoy themselves. Lopresti Park has, as you can see, this is last night. Bunch of guys out there having a good time. Named after two Loprestis, Michael Lopresti and Michael Lopresti, father and son, both of whom were in the Massachusetts legislature. The father for 9 years, the son for 20 years. Very, very involved in East Boston affairs, and having their name on the park, I think is a useful reminder of how much of an Italian neighborhood East Boston was for many, many years. And so that name stays. Many Italians have moved to other neighborhoods now. Lots of other people have moved in from various parts of Asia and Africa and South America, Central America, and so on. But the name continues. So this is it. This is where you go at night to chill in East Boston, Lopresti, and people, all kinds of backgrounds are there having the best time. What I like about Lopresti Park is there are these markers on the ground which show where the tunnels are. I'm standing here above the marker for the Sumner Tunnel, which goes out where you see that rocky jetty. And yet there's one as well for the Callahan Tunnel, and then up where those people are walking, you can see them. That's the Sumner Tunnel. So this is just exactly the same place where the North Ferry went from in its day. And the Sumner Tunnel, I love this picture because it shows it before there was a second tunnel, the Callahan Tunnel. The Sumner Tunnel was built between 1931 and 34. It opened in 34. But this is how I remember it as a kid. It was one way in each direction. And inevitably, it seemed half of the times we went through the tunnel, somebody got a flat tire, and there was nothing anybody could do behind them. It just wait while you got out, took the tire off, took the tube out of the tire, patched the tube, puts the tube back in the tire, put the tire back on. There was no point in saying bad words because that's just all you could do, but sit there and enjoy it. The Callahan Tunnel came along in 1962, made all the difference in the world. That was 2 lanes in one direction, some of 2 lanes in the other. As we speed along here, because I'm running out of time, had we been walking, we would have gone past the Atlantic Works, which was started in 1853 by some of the machinists who'd worked for Otis Tufts, and more boiler making and engines and all kinds of things like that. They also built small steamers and tugboats, but famously they got a contract from the U.S. government to build a monitor-style warship during the Civil War. The building is still there. Many of the buildings we've talked about tonight aren't. It is still there, and it's become an art center, the Atlantic Works Gallery. And I will confess not having to been in to see that, but looking at their things online, as soon as the corona is going to allow us, I want to go over there and take a look. Very, very interesting folks doing things. Now, the last stop on our tour is coming up to where there is what we call a marine railroad, which, if I'm guessing properly, it was probably around here where my cursor is going, somewhere around here. These wharves are gone, but it just shows you what a busy place East Boston was in those days. And if you'll indulge me, up here, if you see the little house where the cursor is now, that was where my great-granduncle had his blacksmith shop. Most of his traffic was shoeing horses, but he also had, people look at the wharves there. Somebody broke a hasp, or they needed a lock, or they needed a hinge or something. They'd send up to Dan, and he'd be making that. And my grandfather, as a young kid, used to stand there being fascinated. Uncle Dan also played a mean fiddle, but he held the violin against his chest for some reason. Now, one of the reasons that a marine railway was built here is because there were beaches on this side of East Boston, and you can see from this little inset is that when they're building a big ship, this is one of Donald McKay's clipper ships, you basically build it right on the beach. You set up a framework, and little by little you built it from the bottom up, and then you knocked off the framework. Then you launched it down a kind of a track device, such as I'm wiggling my cursor over now. But that same principle was used creating what we call marine railways. This is the remnants of one. This is from a few years back, before the land had been improved anyway. Where above here, where you see Mystic Shore Warehouse, that's all gone now. That is a big apartment complex called Boston East. But blessedly, the marine railway has been saved, so it's a connection for us to East Boston as it was back in the day. And nowadays, and the way it worked was that a ship would be floated onto one of these cradles. The platform the ship is sitting on, we call that a cradle. The cradle would, while it was in, that would be, the cradle would be lowered down the marine railway into the water. The ship would float onto it. The cradle would be pulled up with the ship on it onto land, and so they could work on the underside of the ship. This is the largest one in Boston, one of the largest in the United States for a long time. And this is the remnants of it now. Developers have put in this walkway so you can walk over the ruins of the old tracks. They're amazing that they're as well preserved as they are. I suspect it has something to do with the salt water. Interesting, down here you can see the rollers, where in the lower right-hand corner, the rollers around the tracks that brought the platforms up. And this is what we do at the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk. We create signs. So, and there's dozens of these all along the harbor front now. This is one from the Marine Railway site. And we research these things like crazy. We have peer review, which makes academia look like kindergarten. People are really very precise about years and locations and sources of photos and all that kind of stuff. We really want to put anything we put out there. We want it to be very accurate. We work hand in hand with the developers. Developers, thank goodness to our colonial forefathers. They put in the colonial laws Chapter 81, which basically says that everybody has access to the waterfront, and that's been refined in subsequent years. So because of that, we were able to create the Boston Harborwalk, where the public can walk along the edge of the water. 36 years ago, it started under Mayor Raymond Flynn, and it's been going ever since then, people taking advantage of their right to have it. So we've created these signs. You'll see them all around, and they're very pithy. You get 160 words. It's the most you can put on a sign. And believe me, when you're trying to tell a big story, like I've been doing over these last several minutes, and you have to put it in 160 words, it's not easy. And I have to point out that the man in the suit down here with the helmet, that's my cousin George. Okay, so here we are. That's the end of the show. This is looking out from the Harborwalk back across Boston. One of the nicest parts about the Harborwalk is the views, the air, and everything else that you get by being next to the water. So we will now ask some questions. If you have questions, we'd be glad to answer them.
Thanks,
And
Steve.
Alice, what do I do? Just leave this here?
I think it's a beautiful photo, but you also have the option to stop sharing. It's up to you. We've got a few questions coming
we'll
in.
leave that. Okay, okay. Question time.
Yeah. Betsy asks, is there housing for immigrants? Is there still housing for immigrants and workers, or have high rent apartments taken over?
Some of each. Each of the high rent buildings has a certain number of what they call affordable housing units in them, and I don't think I know the figures as to what that is. It's their nod to the reality that most of the people who have lived in East Boston over the last 30, 40 years will never be able to afford the kinds of houses that are being built now. There are in other parts of East Boston the same kind of housing. I mean, houses that were there that my father was born in, my grandfather lived in. You know, it's moderately priced. Having said that, everything in Boston is shot through the roof on rent. So I don't know, Bessie, if I can give you any better an answer than that.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. It looks like so we've gotten a couple of thank yous. I just want to note that Susan Cunningham says thank you.
All right, thank you, Susan.
As do Bill and Sarah Bishop. They are really excited.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, friends from Colorado.
That's great.
Yeah.
Tom Mikas is asking about examples. You showed a building with an open first floor as a strategy.
Yes.
Do you know of other buildings like that, or is that only being done there?
Yeah, they're all built in such a way as to allow for flooding. It's an intentional flooding zone, just because they know it's going to happen sooner or later. Some of them they've masked it. I was over in that area in March, and I could see it. Many of the buildings had not been as much constructed then as they are now, and you could see how the water could go through. That the first floor, it was very, very heavy. Well, it's reinforced concrete, but it was very, very thick. It was much thicker than you might have in even a building downtown. And then above it, it was just, you know, structural stuff like wood and so on and so forth. So from what I could see, it's just a standard thing. Other thing I was told by a developer is that in the corners of many of these buildings, as water runs around corner, it gathers speeds, it's more damaging. So they've deliberately put in things like coffee shops, the hair salons, things like that, not housing units. The idea is that, well, nobody wants anybody's business to be destroyed, but if it is, that'll be easier to fix and to put back than if it were a housing unit. So housing starts at least one flight up.
It's great to know. Betsy says thank you, and a man named Howard Weinstein says thank you from Brazil, and wants to know who has the best clam chowder in East Boston.
Well, you know, he's asking that question because he knows I don't eat clam chowder.
It's a trick question.
Sorry, Howard. But since we always try to please the customer, I'll try to find out.
That's great. Tyler Peck was wondering if you could share a list of references for the industrial history of East Boston. He's really excited about everything you showed, including Vacudyne.
Okay, Vacudyne is one thing. I only know the name, and if somebody knows about that company, it'd be interesting to hear more about them. The industrial, you're talking from really 1833 to the present, and it's changed a lot. One source, a starting source, is not probably everything you want to know, is Nancy Seasholes, who's written a remarkable book called Gaining Ground, which tells about how so much of the land of Boston is filled in and expanded. I don't know the number. It's something like 25, maybe 30% of the land of the city of Boston is filled in land. It might be more than that. I'm just guessing. But she, in writing up the filling in parts, she tells what went on there after the land was filled in, what it was used for. So that's a good place to start. In going down Google rabbit holes trying to track certain things here, very often you find references at the bottom of the page, and one thing leads to the next, and the next, and the next. There is a book called A History of Suffolk County, 1904 or 5 or something like that, which lists, describes a paragraph or two, many of the industries that were in Suffolk County, including all those in East Boston. That might help. But it's a book to be written. There's several books to be written. I mentioned R.H. Eddy's, a civil engineer who laid out the streets in East Boston. If somebody's doing a dissertation, he's a subject. It's very, very hard to get much information on him, and yet his name shows up all over the place, not only as an engineer, but as a man who built water conduits into Boston or planned them from Spot Pond and places north of Boston. I think his family had something to do with that. It was a family property, whatever. But also he was a witness to many, many things. He was parts on boards of directors, this, that, and the other thing. And he gave us East Boston. So that's another one is Otis Tufts. What I told you about Otis Tufts is not everything I know about him, but very nearly. And I've been researching him for about 2 years. So, okay, you PhD candidates, get out there and start looking and send me a copy.
We've gotten some fun extra facts being tossed out here. So Sean McGinnis recommends Ned Devine's for clam chowder. Although I think that's not in Eastie. I think that's in downtown Boston.
That was in Faneuil Hall, and I have a feeling, Sean, that may have closed. I think I saw that it was closed or was closing.
In any case, not Eastie, but a great Boston place to go.
Yeah.
And then Phil recommends, there used to be a book named The History of Shipbuilding in East Boston, available at least at the East Boston Library. So that's another place.
Yes,
people can
yes.
go for resources.
And if that's the one I'm thinking of, it was written about 1910, and very, very detailed descriptions of all of the wooden shipbuilding enterprises up and down the East Boston shoreline.
Yeah. We've gotten a few more thank yous in, and I'll stick around if people have more questions, but I do want to wrap up officially before 8 o'clock to thank Steve. I know that you guys can't physically give him a round of applause, so I'm just going to do a whole bunch of round of applauding. Some of the comments that have come in, and I would completely agree with that. It was really wonderful to hear about your family connections. You know, it was such a personal tour across many generations, in addition to all the other background you shared.
Yeah.
If you're tuned in at home, I do want to note that the Friends of the Boston Harborwalk do a lot of things that Steve has talked about. They offer tours, normally in person and now virtually. They do harbor cleanups along the coastline, and then they work with a Boston Line and Service to clean out marine debris. And they also have what Steve alluded to at the end, the sign committee that is doing incredible sign work all around the Boston Harbor, led by the fearless Liz Nelson Weaver. So if you're interested in getting involved in any of those things, you can reach out to their fearless chair, Mike Manning, or you can visit bostonharbornow.org/friends. That will provide you with information on upcoming tours. You can watch recordings of past tours that are now being recorded because they're in webinar form. And you can follow along. You can also sign up for Boston Harbor Now's e-news if you want to learn about more that's happening on the harbor. And we always include the Friends tours when they're coming. So that's another great way to stay connected. If you are someone who needs a hard stop at 8, we can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. And if you want to stick around a couple more minutes, I can pose a couple more of these questions to Steve, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So
yeah, and I just want to say thank you to all the people who watched us and not the Celtics.
The history nerds.